Hi, my name is Jennifer and I'm from the Administration Office of the Lawrence Branch. Today I would like to share with you a short story by James Thurber. Each week, the Mercer County Library System hosts a short story discussion group on Facebook, and these discussions take place on Wednesdays at 8 p.m. This week's short story is More Alarms at Night. Before I share with you the story, I'd like to tell you a little bit about James Thurber. He was born in 1894 in Columbus, Ohio, and he died in 1961 in New York City. So he spent most of his youth in Ohio. He grew up there, he went to college there, he worked as a journalist a little bit after college there. But the most significant event of his childhood is that he suffered an accident that caused him to lose sight in one eye. Basically, he was playing a game with his brother who accidentally shot an arrow into his eye. And then over the course of his life, he slowly lost sight in the other eye. So for the last 2 decades of his life, he was nearly blind, yet he still continued to produce a significant amount of work, which was quite remarkable. So he worked as a journalist, as I mentioned before, for a little bit in Ohio after college, and then he moved to New York to work for the Evening Post in the mid-1920s. By 1927, he was a managing editor and contributor at The New Yorker, and he got that job because he was friends with E.B. White, who saw value in his work. As a matter of fact, E.B. White chanced upon some of his drawings and published them on his behalf, and that's how Thurber's career as a cartoonist began. So Thurber worked there for a little bit, about 6 years, and then he left. He still contributed essays and short stories of the like to The New Yorker, but he went on to do other things as well. So he became very well known as a fabulist. He wrote fairy tales for children. He wrote a book about someone with whom he worked at The New Yorker. He continued to do cartoons. He just was remarkable in just how much he did and what variety he was able to produce. So the thing about him, if you wanted to find one word to describe him, is, he's a humorist. I actually read somewhere that, Mark Twain is like the humorist of America, and like Thurber comes in second. He was looking to basically write about the frustrations and the eccentricities of the ordinary man. And you'll see that throughout his writing. And you'll see that in this story, More Alarms at Night. So without further ado, here's the story. One of the incidents that I always think of first when I cast back over my youth is what happened the night that my father threatened to get Buck. This, as you will see, is not precisely a fair or accurate description of what actually occurred, but it is the way in which I and the other members of my family invariably allude to the occasion. We were living at the time in an old house at 77 Lexington Avenue in Columbus, Ohio. In the early years of the 19th century, Columbus won out, as state capital, by only 1 vote over Lancaster, and ever since then has had the hallucination that it is being followed. A curious municipal state of mind which affects, in some way or other, all those who live there. Columbus is a town in which almost anything is likely to happen, and in which almost everything has. My father was sleeping in the front room on the 2nd floor next to that of my brother Roy, who was then about 16. Father was usually in bed at 9:30 and up again by 10:30 to protest bitterly against a Victrola record we 3 boys were in the habit of playing over and over, namely, No News or What Killed a Dog, a recitation by Nat Wills. The record had been played so many times that its grooves were deeply cut and the needle often kept revolving in the same groove, repeating over and over the same words. Thus, ate some burnt hoss flesh, ate some burnt hoss flesh, ate some burnt hoss flesh. It was this reiteration that generally got Father out of bed. On the night in question, however, we had all gone to bed at about the same time, without much fuss. Roy, as a matter of fact, had been in bed all day with a kind of mild fever. It wasn't severe enough to cause delirium, and my brother was the last person in the world to give way to delirium. Nevertheless, he had warned Father when Father went to bed that he might become delirious. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Roy, who was wakeful, decided to pretend that delirium was on him in order to have, as he later explained it, some fun. He got out of bed and, going to my father's room, shook him and said, "Buck, your time has come." My father's name was not Buck, but Charles, nor had he ever been called Buck. He was a tall, mildly nervous, peaceable gentleman, given to quiet pleasures and eager that everything should run smoothly. He said, with drowsy bewilderment. "Get up, Buck," said my brother coldly, but with a certain gleam in his eyes. My father leaped out of bed on the side away from his son, rushed from the room, locked the door behind him, and shouted us all up. We were naturally enough reluctant to believe that Roy, who was a quiet and self-contained boy, had threatened his father with any such abracadabra as father said he had. My older brother, Herman, went back to bed without any comment. "You've had a bad dream," my mother said. This vexed my father. "I tell you, he called me Buck and told me my time had come," he said. We went to the door of his room, unlocked it, and tiptoed through it to Roy's room. He lay in his bed, breathing easily, as if he were fast asleep. It was apparent at a glance that he did not have a high fever. My mother gave my father a look. "I tell you he did," whispered father. Our presence in the room finally seemed to awaken Roy, and he was, or rather, as we found out long afterward, pretended to be, astonished and bewildered. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Nothing," said my mother. "Just your father had a nightmare." "I did not have a nightmare," said father, slowly and firmly. He wore an old-fashioned side-slit nightgown, which looked rather odd on his tall, spare figure. The situation, before we let it drop and everybody went back to bed again, became, as such situations in our family usually did, rather more complicated than ironed out. Roy demanded to know what had happened, and my mother told him, in considerably garbled fashion, what father had told her. At this, a light dawned in Roy's eyes. "Dad's got it backward," he said. He then explained that he had heard father get out of bed and had called to him. "I'll handle this," his father had answered. "Buck is downstairs." "Who is this Buck?" my mother demanded of father. "I don't know any Buck, and I never said that," father contended irritably. None of us, except Roy, of course, believed him. "You had a dream," said mother. "People have these dreams." "I did not have a dream," father said. He was pretty well nettled by this time, and he stood in front of a bureau mirror brushing his hair with a pair of military brushes. It always seemed to calm father to brush his hair. My mother declared that it was a sin and a shame for a grown man to wake up a sick boy simply because he, the grown man, father, had got on his back and had a bad dream. My father, as a matter of fact, had been known to have nightmares, usually about Lillian Russell and President Cleveland, who chased him. We argued the thing for perhaps another half hour, after which mother made father sleep in her room. "You're all safe now, boys," she said firmly as she shut her door. I could hear father grumbling for a long time, with an occasional monosyllable of doubt from mother. It was some 6 months after this that father went through a similar experience with me. He was at that time sleeping in the room next to mine. I had been trying all afternoon in vain to think of the name Perth Amboy. It seems now like a very simple name to recall, and yet on the day in question I thought of every other town in the country, as well as such words and names and phrases as terracotta, walla walla, bill of lading, vice versa, hoity-toity, Pall Mall, Bodley Head, Schumann Hike, etc., without even coming close to Perth Amboy. I suppose terracotta was the closest I came, although it was not very close. Long after I had gone to bed, I was struggling with the problem. I began to indulge in the wildest fancies as I lay there in the dark, such as there was no such town, and even that there was no such state as New Jersey. I fell to repeating the word Jersey over and over again until it became idiotic and meaningless. If you have ever lain awake at night and repeated one word over and over, thousands and millions and hundreds of thousands of millions of times, you know the disturbing mental state you can get into. I got to thinking that there was nobody else in the world but me. and various other wild imaginings of that nature. Eventually, lying there thinking these outlandish thoughts, I grew slightly alarmed. I began to suspect one might lose one's mind over some such trivial mental tic as a futile search for terra firma, Piggly Wiggly, Gorgonzola, Prester John, Arc de Triomphe, Holy Moses, Lars and Penates. I began to feel the imperative necessity of human contact. This silly and alarming tangle of thought and fancy had gone far enough. I might get into some kind of mental aberrancy unless I found out the name of that Jersey town and could go to sleep. Therefore, I got out of bed, walked into the room where Father was sleeping, and shook him. He mumbled. I shook him more fiercely, and he finally woke up with a glaze of dream and apprehension in his eyes. "What's matter?" he asked thickly. I must, indeed, have been rather wild of eye, and my hair, which is unruly, becomes monstrously tousled and snarled at night. "Was it?" said my father, sitting up, in readiness to spring out of bed on the far side. The thought must have been going through his mind that all his sons were crazy, or on the verge of going crazy. I see that now, but I didn't then, for I had forgotten the Buck incident and did not realize how similar my appearance must have been to Roy's the night he called Father Buck and told him his time had come. "Listen," I said. "Name some towns in New Jersey, quick." It must have been around 3 a.m. Father got up, keeping the bed between him and me, and started to pull his trousers on. "Don't bother about dressing," I said. "Just name some towns in New Jersey." While he hastily pulled on his clothes, I remember he left his socks off and put his shoes on his bare feet. Father began to name, in a shaky voice, various New Jersey cities. I can still see him reaching for his coat without taking his eyes off me. "Newark," he said, "Jersey City, Atlantic City, Elizabeth, Patterson, Trenton, Jersey City, Trenton, Patterson." "It has 2 names, I snapped. "Elizabeth and Patterson," he said. No, I told him irritably. "This is one town with one name, but there are 2 words in it, like helter-skelter." "Helter-skelter," said my father, moving slowly toward the bedroom door and smiling in a faint, strained way, which I understand now, but didn't then, was meant to humor me. When he was within a few paces of the door, he fairly leaped for it and ran out into the hall, his coattails and shoelaces flying. The exit stunned me. I had no notion that he thought I had gone out of my senses. I could only believe that he had gone out of his, or that, only partially awake, he was engaged in some form of running in his sleep. I ran after him and caught him at the door of Mother's room and grabbed him in order to reason with him. I shook him a little, thinking to wake him completely. "Mary! Roy! Herman!" he shouted. I, too, began to shout for my brothers and my mother. My mother opened her door instantly, and there we were at 3:30 in the morning, grappling and shouting, Father partly dressed, but without socks or shirt, and I in pajamas. "Now what?" demanded my mother grimly, pulling us apart. She was capable, fortunately, of handling any 2 of us, and she never in her life was alarmed by the words or actions of any one of us. "Look out for Jamie," said Father. He always called me Jamie when excited. My mother looked at me. "What's the matter with your father?" she demanded. I said I didn't know. I said he had got up suddenly and dressed and ran out of the room. "Where did you think you were going?" Mother asked him coolly. He looked at me. We looked at each other, breathing hard, but somewhat calmer. "He was babbling about New Jersey at this infernal hour of the night," said Father. "He came to my room and asked me to name towns in New Jersey." Mother looked at me. "I just asked him," I said. "I was trying to think of one and couldn't sleep." "You see?" said Father triumphantly. Mother didn't look at him. "Get to bed, both of you," she said. "I don't want to hear any more out of you tonight. Dressing and tearing up and down the hall at this hour in the morning." She went back into the room and shut her door. Father and I went back to bed. "Are you all right?" he called to me. "Are you?" I asked. "Well, good night," he said. "Good night," I said. Mother would not let the rest of us discuss the affair next morning at breakfast. Herman asked what the hell had been the matter. We'll go on to something more elevating, said Mother. We hope you join us this Wednesday at 8 p.m. on Facebook for a discussion of this story.